so.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. This is going to be fun.
Good.
It's a fun topic to talk about.
Yeah. Got your lavalier?
I have this thing, this thing.
It'll be red when it's on. So hold that towards there.
Oh, I thought it. Okay. I'll go back to on. Thank you for checking.
Good afternoon, friends and neighbors. Welcome to Cultural Thursday, the monthly cultural literacy program of Central Lakes College, where we invite people from around the world to help us better understand the diverse people, perspectives, practices, and places of the planet. My name is Jason Edens, and it's my privilege to not only be an instructor here, but also to facilitate the Cultural Thursday program. I'm really glad you all are here with us today. You know, recently I've been asking myself, where else would we have the opportunity to have speakers like we've had as part of Cultural Thursday? Last month, many of you know, we hosted Michael Laughing Fox Charette, a Native American storyteller. And today, we have Dr. Samantha Jones, an ethnoforester and a professor of geography at Bemidji State University. And again, I ask myself, where else would we have the opportunity to learn about this depth of cultural literacy around the planet? Maybe in the cities, maybe not. So the program that we offer here is an absolute asset to our community, and I'm really glad that y'all can be a part of it. So again, Dr. Jones is a professor of geography at Bemidji State University. She's a personal inspiration and mentor of mine. And without further ado, please help me give Dr. Jones a warm welcome, a warm CLC welcome.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you all for being here today and allowing me to be a part of your Cultural Thursdays. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what I know of sacred trees and forests, and I'm honored to share these stories with you. I want to start by pointing out that this is by no means an exhaustive account of the important trees and forests. There are many examples of those that we hold sacred in many different ways across the world. It's just the ones I've had the privilege to become a little bit familiar with. We'll start by taking a look at definitions of sacred, what that means to various examples of sacred trees and forests, and how that translates into the ways that we take different measures to protect them. A passion for trees and forests is deeply woven into my being, and it became that way from an early age. I was born and raised on the Chippewa National Forest. My brothers and I grew up in the woods. That was our playground. Building forts, catching frogs, just spending time out there exploring. As we grew up, we expanded our explorations, but we stayed connected to the forest in our own different ways. As an example, this is one event, planting trees on the Gunflint after the Ham Lake fire. This was an event that my middle brother Travis organized when he was working for the Superior National Forest. This was a family affair for a number of years. Making my way through college, I worked in various seasonal positions in forest research and management that took me to many different interesting places across the state and beyond, from the Boundary Waters, Canoe Area Wilderness to look at old-growth red pine, to Tanzania to look at sacred forests, and more recently, looking at forests locally through my work with BSU, places like the Red Lake peatlands and old spruce tamarack forests there. I'm grateful that my work allows me the opportunity to remain connected to the forest and to advocate for their sustainable management. Because trees are incredible, right? These giants of the plant kingdom that do magic with sunlight to evolve into these many different forms and impressive shapes and sizes and varieties that they take on to provide habitat and resources for us and so many other organisms. It's no wonder that we look at them in amazement and hold them in high regard and deem some of them sacred. but what exactly do we mean by sacred anyway, right? If we look it up, you'll find there are multiple definitions, and they kind of range along a continuum from things that are dedicated or set apart for service or worship, to being worthy of religious veneration, entitled to reverence, and those things that are just highly valued and important. So kind of this range of definitions. And while it doesn't really have a lot to do with trees, this photo in the background is an illustration of what we mean by this idea of sacred. This is Phobjika Valley in Bhutan. And it's a place of importance because it's the site of one of their more impressive monasteries, one of the most impressive in their country, in fact, and the wintering grounds of the black-necked cranes who arrive every October. And legend has it they circle the monastery 3 times before landing, and then before they leave again, they circle 3 times on their way out. It's just part of the sacredness of this particular valley. So in our journey of taking a look at some of these other examples and how sacredness applies to trees, we'll start in the Kingdom of Bhutan. I was there in 2018 for the World Dendro Conference to present some research I'd been working on with the Forest Service. And part of that event was trying to splice together kind of the traditional knowledge and enhance what they knew of their trees and forests through dendrochronology science so that they could better understand different dynamics about their trees and forests. At the end of this conference, there was a cultural tour to visit some of the sacred places on the landscape. And that related to a theme of the conference in trying to kind of bridge that traditional belief system and enhance it with modern science. Related to that was the unveiling of this book, Historically Significant Trees of Bhutan. And this holds stories of the spirits and deities believed to inhabit and protect the landscape and how that translates into some of the sacredness of these different trees that are featured in the book. Many of the sacred trees in Bhutan are believed to be the walking sticks of important figures, gurus in Buddhism. One such figure is this Apchundu, who is the most important protective deity in Bhutan. And in this particular example, he used his magical powers to create an illusion for this invading Tibetan army to make it look like they had a huge force ready to do battle. And when the army engaged or approached to engage, they found out that it was an illusion and fell into this ravine. And Apchundu planted this tree to honor that victory. And it has stood over time, and it is still honored today. They hold ceremonies, and you can see they put a little bit of a rock wall around it, and there's prayer flags hung from the branches. This tree is still honored in memory of that story of the victory. Another example relating to stories of Guru Rinpoche, one of the most famed gurus in Bhutan. Rinpoche is believed to have been born of the lotus flower, fully enlightened. And he was an important figure in advancing Buddhism, a particular sect of that belief system across Bhutan. And in this particular example, locals believe that the hollow trunk of this tree contains relic items. A tree that was Guru Rinpoche's walking stick. You can see they've filled the center with concrete, and there's different figures and relics in there commemorating the tree. And to boot, this is a big tree, right? 427 centimeters, this is something like 14-foot diameter tree. So in addition to the historic story, this is just a massive individual and a long-lived one at that. Shifting from the examples in the book, I also had the opportunity while I was making our travels through Bhutan to visit some trees personally, such as this sacred Bodhi tree in Punakha Dzong. Punakha Dzong is the structure that you see around the tree. It was a very large fortress, and once the capital of Bhutan, it was constructed in the early 1600s, I think 1636. And the story of the sacred Bodhi tree is that this is a particular species of fig, and it's important because it's the species of tree that Buddha sat beneath when he attained enlightenment. And legend has it that this individual is a cutting from that original Bodhi tree in India, that original sacred tree. Bhutan is an interesting example because of their attempt to blend that traditional with their governance system. There's kind of this parallel in existence in the country. And they've translated fables and stories like the ones in these examples, and like a belief that cutting the slopes will anger the gods and create mudslides. They'll create mudslides to destroy the crops, so don't cut the slopes. That belief in the traditional framework has been translated into a national mandate to maintain 60% forest cover. And the nation currently has something like 70% cover. So they've managed that and then some. But it's interesting to see this idea of sacredness translated into modern applications of that belief. Next stop in our journey is East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania. I spent time in Tanzania as a graduate student while I was at Ohio University, and my work there was looking at sacred forest conservation. It was part of a larger project looking at local knowledge and its role in climate change adaptation. The interest in sacred forests was for their role in climate change mitigation and adaptation resilience, providing resources to locals to kind of enhance their options to adjust to changing climate. The first thing I learned when I arrived at Mangio village in Tanzania, which is this little village in the North Pari Mountains, was that I needed to adjust my understanding of forests, my concept of what a forest was. When you look at this landscape, this photo, do you see things that stand out distinctly as forests? There's lots of trees, but anything that really looks like a classic idea of a forest? Probably not, right? They are there on the landscape, they're just very small. Some of the sacred forests were no more than an acre. The largest was only 4 acres, the village forest. Excuse me. But as I began talking to people, talking to the residents and learning about what they knew of their forests and how they valued them, I realized that they were no less significant despite their modest size. Forests were important and had been for a very long time for a number of reasons. One was the connection to ancestors. Many of these sacred groves, as they were more referred to than forests, were places for family burial sites. People had their own sacred forest for burying their deceased relatives. And there were rituals and practices that they conducted on a routine basis in order to maintain connection with the ancestors, and through that, ensure the annual cycle of rainfall. That was just part of the traditional belief structure. Some of the forests were maintained specifically to protect springs or to enhance water catchment, so more of a physical role in the community. The sacred groves also were enclaves of important native plant and tree diversity. And a lot of these trees and plants find their way into that agroforestry farming portfolio. They planted them specifically in their plots to provide shade, shelter, structure. They were sources of food, medicine. A lot of them were very important for local medicine. You might notice didn't look like there was a CVS in that picture, right? Or a Walgreens. Yeah, there isn't one. So a lot of what they require comes from the landscape. And they have a very deep and long-held knowledge passed on from generation to generation about those resources. Sacred forests were protected by elders in the community. And there were both male and female sacred forests. Some forests were specifically designated for women and protected by them. Likewise, others specifically protected by men. So if you needed some particular resource, you would have to approach the elders and ask permission. Just anybody couldn't help themselves to the resources in the forest. You weren't even supposed to be in there, in fact, without permission. I heard from some of the school kids, however, that the forest close to the school, once in a while, they snuck in there just to see if they could get away with it. Leave it to school kids, right? But suffice it to say, they were closely guarded in order to ensure those resources and protect the sacredness of those groves. And the interest in sacred forests relates to the fact that across East Africa, as cultures converted to more modern worldviews and kind of shifted away from their traditional practices, in many places the sacred groves were being lost. They didn't hold the same significance anymore, as people no longer maybe adhered to those traditional customs and beliefs, so they would cut the forest and use the landscape for something else. What I found in Mangio when I was talking to people about the importance of the forests and should they be maintained, I was finding something a little different. Mangio seemed to defy that trend. Asking people about the forests and their importance, the answer was always, well, yes, of course, we should continue to protect them. Okay. Why? Well, because they're important for water was often the answer. If it wasn't for traditional practice, which is a viewpoint pretty much only the eldest elders in the community still held, what was the role of the forest? The answer was always pretty much the same. The most common response in the list of reasons was for water. And the difference in how the forests promoted water availability is where there was some distinction between age groups. The elders still believed in some of those traditional customs and practices and connection to the ancestors, whereas younger generations were more inclined to say, well, duh, the hydrology of the region, right? I mean, sometimes they looked at me incredulously like, you're the researcher, you're asking us this simple question? Come on, you ought to know this, right? Is this a trick question? It was important for hydrology, and they recognized that. So that sacred interpretation of forests, that long-held belief and connection to ancestors being the reason for annual rainfalls, kind of translating, again, similar to the way that it had changed in Bhutan, from that sacred framework into a more ecological understanding, but with the same outcome. Forests are being protected and respected and retained on the landscape. Just about 100 miles from Mangio, which isn't a lot farther than I drove today to get here from Bemidji, we have a very different landscape in Kibwezi, Kenya. You'll notice there isn't much of anything here that looks like forest. Part of that is due to the elevation change, right? We're now down in kind of the lowland savanna area, more of a woodland than we are a mountain forest region. So the interaction between people and the environment here was a little bit different, and it reflected more of that utilitarian importance of plant and forest resources, tree resources. No less important, but a little bit different expression of how that was acted on. And the work I did here was connected to work that Dr. Mark Lawrence, a colleague at Bemidji State University, has been doing there for a number of years, political ecology, research and service work. And at the time, I was just between finishing my work at BSU, graduating from there and moving on to Ohio University for my graduate work. So it was kind of an ethnobotany study that I was working on and contributing to his larger ongoing work to understand and catalog how are people making use of these resources and how are they getting access to them. So one of the things that trees and local plants were significant for in this region was just understanding the landscape, reading the connection and seasonal timing of things. And it wasn't just trees, but other animals as well. The baobab trees pictured in this photo, these large, kind of smooth-barked trees that appear dead. They're not, by the way. They're drought deciduous trees. They're just waiting for the right time to sprout their leaves and come back to life. The importance of these particular trees, just as an example of that local ecological knowledge, was that people would watch these for the first flowering and know, okay, we can plant our crops. The rains are coming any day. The trees are telling us it's time. While forests maybe weren't a big part of the landscape, tree resources were still really important. As you can see by this nursery sign, trees are wealth and our strength. It was well understood that trees were significant and important resources. While they didn't maybe deem them sacred, there was still a collective effort and an individualized effort to have and plant and maintain local trees. This is their nursery, and you can see that all of these little seedlings in their containers are waiting for somebody to take them home to their farm and plant them. These are mostly local varieties, native varieties. They're not the interesting and hybridized, unique botanical cultivars that we find at our greenhouse here. So reflecting on that continuum of sacred, we've kind of made our way through those things in Bhutan that were deemed religiously sacred in the most common sense that we probably think of the word, and the utilitarian sense, things that are venerated and important in different ways. And now we've kind of arrived at this idea of statistically significant, maybe. Things that are extraordinary, and we revere them for that reason. We'll take a look at some of those examples. Legendary trees. Trees like General Sherman, named after the Civil War general. A giant sequoia, 275 feet tall, over 36 feet in diameter. By volume, this is the largest tree on the planet, right? That we know of. I should put that disclaimer out there for all of these. That we know of to this point, right? There are a lot of trees on the planet. So at 52,500 cubic feet, that's something like 9,800 and some bathtubs full of water if we could fill the trunk of this tree. That's a really big tree. General Sherman is protected by being part of a national park system. And you can see there's a fence around that rooting zone to protect from compaction because he gets a lot of traffic. This is an impressive, interesting tree. Recently, Park Service staff have been putting foil around the base of the tree. It must have taken a lot of foil to protect that tree. And they're trying to just protect it from wildfires in the region, just to create a heat deflection there. Sequoias are fire dependent, but nevertheless, when we have these really unique, magnificent specimens, we try to protect them. The broadest tree would be the tree of Tule, a Montezuma cypress in Mexico. This tree's trunk, the circumference of it is 42 meters. This is the stoutest trunked tree in the world. You can see that this too is fenced. You can see a human for scale just off the corner of it there. This is an impressively large tree. Its trunk is wider than the length of a school bus, right? The tree of Tule is in the courtyard of a Catholic church, and it's also protected by an admission fee of sorts, so it's not just a free-for-all. It's not quite as locked down as maybe the sacred forest in Tanzania, but it's not just open to visitors without some way to moderate the amount of traffic around the tree. Hyperion holds the record for being the tallest known living tree on the planet. At 115 meters tall, it's taller than the Statue of Liberty by something like 25% taller. It's a very tall tree, coast redwood. And because this tree is so spectacular for its height, notice it's towering above the canopy and all of the other trees that surround it. It's not within a national park or some other structure to grant it any protections. So just this year, in fact, in August, I believe it was, there's been some ruling passed. I forget how this is implemented, But you can't just go up to the tree anymore without risking a $500 fine and potentially jail time. The tree was getting so much attention, something had to be done to kind of stem the flow of visitors and the impact they were having on the tree itself and the surrounding area. So, Methuselah holds the record for being the old tree. This bristlecone pine is named after the oldest living biblical figure at 4,854 years old, as confirmed by dendrochronology samples, so core samples, to verify those individual annual rings and count the years. This tree is older than the Egyptian pyramids, has a lot of history in this tree. And that's part of our intrigue and appreciation with old trees. They have stories to tell. It's part of what my work focuses on, is looking at those stories and interpreting what do they mean for various applications. A rival for the status of oldest tree is Jomansugi, a Yakushima Island cypress in Japan, estimated to be somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 years old. But that age is unverified. So as yet, Methuselah still holds the record. This is also an impressively large tree, 25 meters tall and a 16-meter circumference, so a very stout tree. This tree, when it was discovered, sparked a whole conservation campaign on this Yakushima Island to protect the old-growth cypress that inhabit that island. Discovery that this uniquely old tree was a part of that forest system initiated interest in preserving the island, and it is now designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So if individual old trees are cool, more old trees is better, right? Old growth forests are another thing that we take interest in. And while for the most part, at least here in the US, we don't deem them sacred necessarily, we do take special measures to protect them, understand them, and recognize their importance. So old growth forests tend to be filled with old trees. As you can see in this photo, lots of deadwood, both down and standing. They create habitat for late successional forest dwelling species. And they're good examples of forest communities and ecosystem function and composition that don't really exist widely on the landscape, right? So they're a good representative site to understand how those systems work and the importance of them. A lot of the work that I do with my dendrochronology research at BSU is looking at candidate old growth stands, so stands that might be old enough to be considered old growth, by verifying ages, so taking those increment core samples, counting the rings to determine with more certainty than just looking at them in the field, how old are these trees, and is that, as one condition of the evaluation, old enough to meet old growth designation status. It seems the sacredness of trees and the stories they hold and the ways that we attach meaning to them are something that have a unifying characteristic across human culture and across time. From stories of Yggdrasil and the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge in the Garden of Eden, all of those fabled tales and the lore of trees are things that kind of bridge that divide between our cultural and philosophical and religious understandings and beliefs about trees and the world we inhabit, and our scientific understanding as well. It's one of those unifying elements that binds us together. And with that, I will end with a photo of a place that is sacred to me. You won't find it in any of the registers of amazing, extraordinary trees. It's not designated old growth or anything else particularly special, but it's the maple forest that I call home, and it's my favorite place on the planet. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. And I have, as I was talking about dendrochronology and old growth, I have some samples that Jason is going to help me to share with you. These are from a red pine candidate old growth stand that Minnesota DNR is reviewing. And these are cores that I have worked up already. So the sample is taken from the tree. It's just a little round piece of wood. It's glued into a grooved block of wood, little mounting stick. And then after the glue dries, sanded multiple times so that you can see clearly the annual growth rings. And you'll recognize that by the pattern of light and dark bands. Each pair of light and dark is 1 year of growth. Some of these date back to 1927, 1918, early 1900s. So they're not rivals for, record book status or anything like that. But they are significantly old in terms of red pine, old enough that the site they came from is under review for possible old growth designation. It's a candidate stand.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. And as you all are thinking about some questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Jones, I'd like to kick it off with a question myself. Here in the United States, of course, we preserve a lot of our forest land. Here in the state of Minnesota, we have state forests, we have national forests. We have a wide variety of ways in which we preserve forests. My question is two-part. First, how is that an example of a cultural forest or a sacred grove here in the United States? And also, to what extent are some of those cultural assets or those forests being decolonized and repatriated to indigenous communities? And how is that related to cultural forests?
Good questions, both of them. So in terms of sacred and the definition that we started with at the top of that list, they're probably not. They reflect more of a utilitarian investment almost in a resource with the national forests. Thinking back on how those were originally established and designated, it was a recognition that, boy, we need forests, we need trees for the resources they provide. So some of that impetus was making sure that there was a reserve of forests, that it didn't all become cleared landscape for agriculture and other purposes, that we were retaining that feature of the landscape as we progressed in developing our country. That's not true of all of them, of course. There are also examples where a particular pristine wilderness was deemed such because of its aesthetic value, maybe its habitat attributes, just the significance that we assign to trees through all of those. Well, we didn't even look at all that many. There's a much longer list of extraordinary trees, but reasons that somebody deemed important enough to set that particular site aside as a national park or part of some other recognized feature on the landscape that was worthy of retaining for the long term. And we approach it a little bit differently in that there's not that kind of mystical, sacred, religious connection to it, but it's still an expression of protecting a thing that matters to us. And with regard to the indigenous landscapes, there we probably are talking more about a sacredness that is familiar in the definition that was at the top of that list, a connection to the landscape that reaches back to almost mystical understandings of the connections and the connections between humans and the landscape and trees, and the way that that interaction was valued and understood, and what that meant for how the trees were managed as such. And we don't often think about Indigenous Americans as managing the landscape, but there's some interesting research in dendrochronology, by the way, colleagues of mine, doing some really fascinating work on fire history reconstruction and understanding that certainly in this Great Lakes landscape, a lot of those fires that we thought were natural caused fires, lightning ignition or whatever it might have been, really probably weren't. They were cultural fires. Native Americans were deliberately setting fire for different management reasons. whether it was clearing the underbrush for blueberries to grow or any number of other reasons. Those fires and the frequency of them and the occurrence of them in combination with other markers in the trees indicates that no, there was human involvement here. This wasn't just all lightning. We didn't have that many lightning strikes for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden lightning changed and we didn't, right? So yeah, a lot to unpack there, but either way, important connections to that resource, and it's just kind of in the way that we talk about it, express it, and act on it, that there's a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Other questions? Again, she's traveled from Tanzania to Bhutan, helping communities manage cultural forests. Yes, sir.
This is probably off topic a bit, but have you seen examples of the Miyawaki method of dense planting for reforesting areas? Miyawaki method?
I'm not familiar with that, no. Can you explain it to me a little bit? What does that mean?
It was devised by this Japanese guy, Mr. Miyawaki, and to replant areas where this forest had been clear cut or there was bare ground. And it was a community thing in India where I guess they've done most of it, where they'll plant very dense areas, small forest, small foliage type things, and getting bigger and bigger. It seems to be very labor intensive. I'm just wondering if you had come across that at all. Miyawaki was the guy's name.
I have not, actually. So in this layer, is it a layered planting? Are they trying to get at diverse compositional and structural?
From what I've read about it,
Okay.
they start off with low-growing kinds of bushes and shrubs and things, and then over the course of a couple of years, apparently, you put in, you let that grow, and then you fill in behind it, and so eventually you get this very dense forest, but apparently it only works on a small scale because it's so labor intensive.
I could imagine it would be, yeah. So kind of a staged planting to hasten successional development, maybe? Is that what they're after?
Right, and you get very dense growth.
Sure.
That's the idea.
So, okay, some shade-tolerant members in that mix, obviously, if they're underplanting. I'm not familiar with that term, but the strategy of trying to promote complexity and diversity in forest planting so that they mimic more of that old-growth forest characteristic, yes, that is...
Native plants and indigenous plants are what they're after. Okay. Thanks.
Yep, locally adapted.
There's a lot of it on the internet, of course.
Yeah, naturally, yeah.
Conspiracy theories.
With potential old growth in Minnesota, what's the story behind the Lost 40 up in northern Minnesota?
Oh, the Lost 40, that's a fun one. So the Lost 40 is called such because they essentially missed it in the mapping and early logging of the state. Somehow, in the way that they did those initial surveys and plotting out of the land, that scrap was just missed, that plot of land they didn't realize existed, essentially. So they did all of their work around it and then realized much later, well, hey, we missed a spot. And then realizing that by that point, it was like, well, maybe we should leave that spot. Maybe that's a good reference condition and serves as kind of that old growth anchor point to see how does the forest develop if it hasn't had human influence in there changing the structure and diversity either by planting or removing. So, yeah, good question.
Dr. Jones, you asked, you mentioned that in Bhutan, there's a policy, evidently, that 60% of the forest will be maintained.
Right.
I'm curious, how many countries have a similar policy, and to what extent is that culturally motivated?
Wow, that's a big question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that one to be able to quantifiably tell you how many, but I can say that as far as I know, not very many. Bhutan is unique in having a mandate to maintain a particular quantity of forest, and especially one that high. Well, there might be targets for, we should try to maintain, and it would be in our best interest to reserve and protect. To have something that clearly spelled out, and that ambitious of a goal is unique. I won't say it's exclusive to Bhutan, but it is quite rare.
The question I have is there a certain formula that you use when you do your core samples, like so high, diameter, and if there is some trees are odd shaped also? Could you
Yeah,
more
yes.
information about that?
Yes to all of that. So for how high, I'll try to unpack these one at a time if I remember them. Remind me if I forget one of importance there that you asked. It depends kind of on what you're trying to answer. If you're really trying to get at the absolute age of a tree as best we can tell, generally speaking, you want to take that core sample from lower on the ground, close to the ground, because you're getting close to that root-shoot interface where the tree began growing in both directions, from the roots down and from the roots up. And the closer you are to that, the more you are capturing the true age. Most often, because it's easy and standardized practice, for just grabbing a core simply to get a kind of a good reference for how old a tree is, it's typically what's considered breast height, 4.5 feet tall. From there, you're at a good angle to get pressure on the tree, turn the increment bore, collect your sample. Everybody kind of does it that way. It's simple, it's recognized. But then you have to adjust, how long did it take that tree to get this tall? And you have to add that many years for that species to your increment core sample, because it's missing all of those years that it grew to reach that point. Diameter and how do you deal with like irregular shaped trees? The absolute center of growth in a tree is not necessarily the geometric center of the tree, and all trees are not perfectly round either. So it does become a little bit complicated to figure out when you approach a tree, how do you position yourself to get the best sample, right? The most accurate core. And part of that does just have to do with looking at the tree and trying to pick the most geometrically regular part of the tree that you can get your sample from, trying to avoid branch stubs. If you're looking at a conifer, it's going to have that whorled growth pattern of low branches. If you have a tree that is pitched on a slope, approaching that from the side angle of it, not either upslope or downslope of the tree, just to avoid pressure wood and compression wood that would affect the compaction, the closeness or width of those rings, trying to compensate for the lean of the tree, give it strength. What else did you ask me? Did I get them all?
We have another question right here.
Sure.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for being here, Doctor. I wonder if you're familiar with the indigenous tribe in South America that harvests Palo Santos.
I am not. Tell me more about them. What's the significance of...
Well, I'm seeing advertisements scrolling, and apparently there's an indigenous tribe in Brazil that only harvests downed trees, and it's a very delicious scented wood.
Okay.
You've never heard of that?
I've heard of Palo Santos, but I guess I didn't realize that the harvest methods were particular to an individual.
Yeah, it's some from
tribe.
some indigenous tribe down there. And
Okay.
I'm looking for verification that they only use downed trees.
I see. So it's an effort to, what are the words I'm looking for here? To kind of promote like locally sustainable, small scale, not industry, but innovation, and it's kind of like the small batch coffees or produce or those kinds of things that are locally sourced and sustainably produced. Okay, interesting. No, sorry, I can't answer that one for you, if that is in fact their practice or not.
Hi, I just wanted to put this question. It sort of not goes with his, but I was wondering if you think some of the sacred forests are rainforests, like in Brazil. Um, if you have a group or I don't know, not a club, but do you ever speak about them? They're cutting a lot of the forest down there because of their leader, Brazil leader, the new one. Anyway, if they cut a lot of rainforest out there in Africa and India and that's going to be air quality that we're not going to have because the trees have carbon dioxide. They put out oxygen for us. And there's 7 billion people, and if they cut a lot of that, it's going to affect the human. If they're not planting trees, we're not going to have no air.
Right, right.
What's the
absolutely.
relationship between climate change, deforestation, and sacred groves?
Right, yeah. Climate change, deforestation, and sacred groves, a lot there. And there's strong interest and relationships there. So strong relationships and interest in maintaining forest cover just broadly, whether they're sacred groves or not, for the purpose of mitigating climate change impacts. Trying to maintain those carbon sequestering and storage reservoirs that forests are. They have a huge role in that. So yes, the deforestation in tropical regions, anywhere actually, not just the tropical regions, but those are a big one of interest because they are such productive forests and have such a big role in offsetting carbon emissions and sopping that up and helping to kind of slow the effects of advancing climate change. Sacred forests, kind of bringing it back to the work in Tanzania, part of the interest there was related to climate change. So it was the climate change, local knowledge and climate change adaptation project was kind of the bigger umbrella that I was doing my work under. And the concern for the loss of the sacred forest was related to just a concern for loss of forests generally. And what can be done at that local level to promote folks keeping their forests, whether they're sacred forests, however this is being managed in these small landscapes, how do we promote keeping the forests intact? Have you heard of the RED program, this global program to reduce emissions from reducing deforestation and forest degradation? That was active in the region at that time. It maybe still is. Part of their structure to encourage reforestation and maintaining forests was to give payments to local communities to help kind of reduce the need for extractive uses of the forests and provide payment. If you keep your forests, we'll give you this amount of funding support. Kind of like the carbon offset programs that are out there now, but more direct payment for just keeping the forests on the landscape. Not as intricately complicated as some of those carbon offset programs that I'm hearing about, which are also really big right now. Just the family forest something, again, an incentive to private landowners to manage their forests in a way that they're creating additive benefits to the carbon capture and storage potential of the forest lands that they own.
Stewardship plans.
Yeah,
Dr.
kinda
Jones,
like stewardship plans,
we probably have time for just one more question, and I'd really like to give a student an opportunity to ask a question.
Sure.
So, last question, y'all. Students, yes?
So, how important would you say it is, as of right now, for us to make more preservation efforts? So, if you were to compare,
Yeah.
if you were going to compare deforestation to the environmentalism efforts, how close are we to doing it?
Wow.
Oh boy.
There we go.
Oh, that's a sobering question. I'm going to deflect just a little bit because that's like the $100 million question. If I had an answer for that, well, yeah, wouldn't the world be different? So to bring it to the scope of planting trees and what can you do individually, how does that slogan go? Something about the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago. The second best time is right now. Yeah, I mean, anything that we can do individually to either maintain the trees that you have in your sphere of influence, trees and forests, keep them healthy, plant more if you can. Do plant native species, things that are adapted to your region, right? I'm all for trying to maintain that local native environment and the trees and plants that should be there. Nothing against the botanical cultivars, but they just sometimes run away and outcompete the local things, the native things that are more ecologically beneficial, right? So anything you can do in that regard in your own immediate vicinity that you can influence is great. If you can find other ways to volunteer, become involved in programs that are working to promote forest health and forest expansion and diversity on the landscape, yeah, that's energy well spent. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Thank you all of you for being here today, and most importantly, thank you, Dr. Jones. Our next Cultural Thursday will be the 1st of December, and it's a lifetime of service in Haiti. So I hope to see you all then. Thank you so much for being here, y'all. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here, y'all.
Hi there. Certainly.